All right, welcome everyone. It's a miserable day outside. We're glad we had at least some people in attendance, and our viewing audience on YouTube will enjoy this. I'm Christian Novi. I'm president of the Political Science Club. The Political Science Club, in coordination with the Political Science Department, are presenting an Uprising panel, particularly focusing on the uprising in the Ukraine and the conditions that have preceded. We have a great panel today. We have Dr. Lodel, Dr. Polsky, and Dr. Jake Lewandowski. We're going to be talking about most of the issues before the uprising, during the uprising, and of course now the annexation of Crimea. I'll be asking some questions, but I want it to be more of a discussion amongst the panelists as well as the audience. I will be accepting questions. I'll ask a question just to keep the discussion going, but it's more about you guys and the panelists. So without further ado, we'll start with a little introductions from each panelist, starting with Dr. Lodel.
Well, thank you. I'm glad I get to go first here. Thank you for putting on the panel and the Political Science Club and for my colleagues here. I'm going to kind of just raise three general kind of areas, themes, ideas for us maybe to discuss further. And part of them are just looking at the implications and the explanations for what's going on in the Ukraine. The first thing I think we should understand is that what's happening in the Ukraine is an aftershock, if you will, of the great earthquake of 1989, 1990, right? So the kind of geostrategic, to use Jake's geostrategic kind of thinking, those tectonic plates of Europe have shifted, and we're still dealing with the rippling effects throughout the rest of kind of Europe and Eurasia. And so, this is the kind of aftermath of a great power, the Soviet Union, imploding, crippled, but trying to reassert itself, at least within its kind of regional spheres of influence. So it's a classic kind of power story in Europe that is part of a longer 20-year kind of period here. So that's one thing to be very thinking of. It's a bigger, larger.
Have you read my notes?
No, I didn't read your notes. I apologize. That's why I went first, so I could steal Jake's notes from him. But no, I didn't read your notes. But that's one way of thinking of it, or taking a look at it. So the second is, this is really a story about Europe, all right? I mean, in some ways, while this crisis had been going on and the tensions had been brewing for ages in some ways, the spark, if you will, had to do with an agreement that the Ukrainian government was going to sign with the European Union to lead to closer Western European Union economic and political relationships and integration. And in some ways it was the natural kind of outgrowth of the European Union's kind of eastward expansion, and that the debate was whether the Ukraine would maybe someday join the European Union, and certainly one could see that perhaps in the next 10 years as we would go down a further path of European Union enlargement. And then, of course, that then precipitated the crisis in some ways. Putin kind of intervening diplomatically, politically, economically by offering an alternative economic kind of package of trade and relations, which led to the streets and the uprising. And we are now then dealing with near civil war. So in some ways, this is very much a story about Europe and the European Union and the somewhat logical outgrowth of European Union expansion to the east, and what this all means. In some ways, it's a success story that we even talk about Ukraine potentially joining the EU, or perhaps at one time was going to join the EU. But at the same time, it does kind of expose some deep fissures within the membership of the EU, countries like Germany, which has strong economic ties to Russia, the gas kind of dependency of the European Union on Russia, and really just how much power and influence the Europeans have to kind of sway and influence what's going on in the Ukraine. The last point that I would make, and kind of for us maybe to discuss and think about and get your perspectives on, is that in some ways the crisis in the Ukraine is the kind of necessary backlash against U.S. foreign policy. And I think of it in kind of two ways. One, the kind of the expansion of U.S. power via NATO into, again, the close regions and borders of Russia. Imagine, the United States facing a very large and very powerful military strategic alliance edging up along its borders, and how the United States would react to that. Not very kindly. And certainly the pushback, which Stephen Walt talks about in one of his books, that was inevitable. I mean, it's a geostrategic argument too, that when one country or one bloc pushes out against the regional interests of one other country, there's going to be some pushback. So the question is, what does this all mean for U.S. foreign policy, NATO expansion? You have countries, the Baltic states in particular, with large ethnic Russian minorities, but belong to NATO, which carries with it, of course, the Article 5 Collective Security Agreement, which means an attack on Lithuania or Estonia or Latvia would come with a guarantee of U.S. military assistance. And this is really intriguing, all right, if you think about what we might be talking about here. The second point about the backlash has to do with, U.S. support or non-support for democratic uprisings, right? I think we should all be clear that American support for democratic uprisings around the world is entirely dependent on whether that uprising is in U.S. interests or not. And if it's not, they won't support it. If it is, they will support it. So when the people were in the streets of Kiev, trying to push out kind of the Yanukovych and the Russian-controlled government, influenced government, we were all supportive of that. But when Russians in Crimea decided that maybe their interests lie with Crimea and that they voted, albeit that wasn't a really free and fair election, but nonetheless some expression of opinion, we condemn it, right? So the irony, of course, is that U.S. foreign policy is a conflicted mess of hypocrisy when it comes to support or non-support for democratic uprisings of one sort or another. So I think again, we're trapped. U.S. foreign policy is trapped in its support or non-support for these kinds of movements. So 3 things maybe to think about: the larger geostrategic picture, the European Union question, and the question of the future of the European Union, and the question of U.S. foreign policy, implications for U.S. policy. The one area, the implications for NATO and our collective security guarantees to the Russian border, and then support or non-support for democratic movements, of which we're seeing various strands in the Ukraine. So I'll stop there.
We are seeing now a very dramatic development, the consequences of which are totally unpredictable. And I would place major blame on the Ukrainian authorities, current Ukrainian authorities, and certainly on the United States government, which is not knowing what it is doing. Because we could have easily prevented all these disastrous developments, very costly developments, if the US government had taken a more cautious approach, taking into consideration the natural concerns of the Russians. You should know your capabilities, what you can. So when the Russians audaciously took Crimea, the United States could offer only lip service. It's tremendous humiliation. If the United States could have calculated reasonably what should have been done, an agreement with the Russians, an acceptable agreement, was totally feasible. Allow Ukraine to be neutral, offer some moderation to the hotheads in Kyiv, that's the capital of Ukraine, and the matter could have been solved. No. Now we have a disaster underway. Absolutely no way what will happen. A civil war, a war between Russia and Ukraine, all that is quite possible. Eastern and Western Ukraine have tremendous difference. That difference could have been resolved through international intervention, but Western countries and the United States absolutely disregarded what Russia could have done. The fact that Putin arranged for the takeover of Crimea was an absolute surprise that could have been foreseen easily. Russia has enough force to do that and get away with that. That's what we have now. What will happen tomorrow is everybody's guess. So that's what we have. It's a very concrete and very miserable situation where everybody will lose, including Russia. Russia will pay heavily. They are in trouble economically, and Putin has lots of talk, hot, strong words for what he is doing. But when emotions are over, they will have to calculate. That's what we have today. A very miserable, painful situation where everybody will lose and very difficult to come up with any reasonable solution. Taking into account that Russia already seized Crimea, which is a very daring step, and the Ukrainians will not sit still in front of such abject humiliation. That's what I can say for starters.
And now for something completely different. I'm going to make the case that there is two uprisings. These address the first uprising. There's an uprising right now that is pro-Russian. And I'm going to present the case or make the argument that that is an opportunity fomented by Russia to seize the natural resources and the strategic capabilities of the Ukraine. I'm going to take a short time to discuss the use of the languages. That is the language of posturing, not the languages themselves in the Ukraine. Although I have some maps that I'd like to put up shortly to display this if possible. And in making this argument, I'm going to talk about opportunity, motives, and methods. And as I'm going to prosecute this case, essentially. So I put together a couple pages of notes. I'm sorry, this will only take about 4 minutes to read through. At the same time, promise, this is terrible. Those of you who have suffered through my class know that if I do not work from notes, I get off on a rant, and God only knows where that ends up, or who gets. Now, the reason I came here because I was promised that you guys often break into fist fights. And I just wanted to be a part of that. So let me take just a minute and pass out the papers that constitute my notes, and you can read through this. And as you read through this, it won't take long. I will spend just a few minutes talking over the top of them. And I'm going to talk about this second uprising. If you don't mind just throwing those around. Thank you so much. If you don't mind throwing some of those around. Thank you very much. If you don't mind, thank you very much.
So we will come back to the question in a year or so, because it's too tiring to work there. It's too much application. That's what I figure out. For a change, it will work for me. Probably that's my feeling, but you have your own.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm sort of confused by this second uprising, this pro-Russian uprising, because my study and following of uprisings across the globe has been that they've been intended to make people's lives better. The purpose has been to make people's lives better. People are protesting the circumstance in which they have been placed. The idea behind joining Russia seems somewhat illogical. Over the last 5 years, the Russian economy has grown at 1.3% per year on average. That's less growth than we have had. The economy is stagnant. There are no opportunities in Russia, economic opportunities. It seems illogical as well because the economy is controlled by the government, and the government is ranked in the top 25% of all corrupt governments, according to Transparency International. It ranks 39th out of 163 governments. Nigeria has less corruption than Russia, according to Transparency International. In that regard, joining Russia seems to be somewhat illogical. And so, why would people be fighting to join Russia? If you look at the geography of the uprisings, you'll get a short lesson in how actions not only have consequences, they have an arena in which they operate. And matching the geography of the uprising to the theories of geopolitics, we're going to be able to see a number of things. So there's a brief discussion of what geopolitics is and how it works. And I linked it to your international relations studies with the book by Kenneth Waltz, so that you can see how these issues that you address also are the issues that we address. Although we add in geopolitics an element that is driven by, for example, the strategic needs for resources. And I'm going to argue that this is a theft of Ukraine's natural gas, oil resources, and shale gas reserves, especially with respect to Crimea. Now, as we work our way through here, this is going to play out in a foreign policy that is much unlike the US foreign policy. This is a policy based on revanchism, has a strong hint of Russian chauvinism, and also incorporates this great power politics, geopolitics. And so together what we get are the uprisings, the second wave of pro-Russian uprisings resulting from this impetus to make an opportunity for Russia to seize these geostrategic resources. Now, you can follow this along, and I'm going to try to summarize it real quickly. There's a short section on both revanchism and Great Russian chauvinism in a short discussion. On the second page, the outcome of these things has been a Ukraine that is battered by pro-Russian protests. While the first wave of protests took place in the streets and was violent to some extent, especially in terms of property damage, now what we have are pro-Russian protests taking over buildings and claiming to be sovereign entities in those buildings. They are well-armed or reasonably well-armed compared to the first wave of protesters. Now, there's a short section here on great power politics. The whole idea behind great power politics is that the powerful dictates to the weak. And that's what's going on here, the powerful. The Russians are dictating to the Ukrainians. They have leveraged the pipelines, they've leveraged Ukraine's debt, they have leveraged the Ukrainian population and its historical links, tenuous though they may be, to current Russian practices in order to pressure Ukraine into doing what Russia wants. And that is great power politics at play. Just as an aside, at the bottom of this third page is a quick note about language. You notice that Putin talks about protecting Russian speakers. He does not talk about protecting ethnic Russians. He talks about protecting Russian speakers, and he talks about the Russian speakers in Ukraine. Now, I'm sorry to do this to you, but I have a map up here of Russian speakers in Ukraine. And it would be really nice to see. Is it possible to show these?
Yeah, you can use that computer over there. Although, while you're doing that,
Use a computer.
could we get some,
You know how to use that thing?
No, that's why I'm going to ask Christian to do it. There should only be one PowerPoint presentation. It's just a series of maps. If you look at where Russian speakers are, and you look at the map of how many or how dominant Russian speakers are in any particular area, if you look at the broad scale maps, you'll see eastern Ukraine covered. But if you look at the administrative districts of the towns and urban areas, you'll see that it is far more scattered and far lower than the original maps. You see, geography reveals that there are not so many Russian speakers as you would think. I'm sorry, I'm supposed to be standing in front. This is terrible.
you could just sit
Stay
down.
still.
You know, I think I'll just dance. And I'm sorry to mess up your camera. But here we see, now, this is fascinating to me. The red areas are the areas in which Russian is the dominant language. And you can see that Ukrainian language is in fact dominant everywhere, not just the West, as we have been told, and not just a mix, as we've been told, in central Ukraine. If in fact you look at this, by the way, is out of the 2001 Ukrainian census. The 2010 Ukrainian census has not yet been published. Oh, thank you very much. But this is where they are, and what do you see? Luhansk, Donetsk, and what do we see here as well? What we see is a product of Russification, decades of Russification have been imposed upon the Ukrainian peoples, in which Ukrainian cultural practices, the Ukrainian language, and Ukrainian culture was punished and replaced by the Russian language, Russian culture in textbooks, in schools, everywhere along. No wonder there are Russian speakers almost everywhere. But here, especially because these are the urban industrial areas where Russification was most strongly prosecuted. And guess where we're seeing the pro-Russian uprisings? In these very places. So, what we see here is we have to get down to a more discrete scale. And so we're going to have to talk about the correspondence between geopolitical theory, geopolitical reality, and I'm sorry to make you laugh at this, but you've suffered through this before.
I recognize where this is going.
You know where this is going. Thank you. And perhaps you should get it then, because I'm starting to get worked up already.
Well, why don't we go to the other panelists for an opinion?
You're welcome to jump in at any time if you'd like.
I think, just commenting a little bit on Jake's map up there, I mean, it's interesting to see that, where some of these kind of uprisings and takeovers of police stations and city halls in the east in some of these towns, that you're right, these aren't like ethnic Russians. They are, Ukrainians of one sort or another, or they speak Russian, but it's really in their economic interests. They see Russia as the savior in some ways, to bring them jobs, to bring them money, to bring them resources, to bring them something better. I mean, these places, especially in eastern Ukraine, are even more industrially devastated and economically depressed and more poor and with higher unemployment. So in some ways, people are just voting out of their economic pocketbook, right? I mean,
Makes
perfect sense, right? So they're looking at this and saying, do I got a better deal with the so-called Western-leaning Ukrainian government and the money coming from the EU and the IMF, or am I better off perhaps with Putin and the Russian government and maybe the resources and supposed better life that I might have under Mother Russia? So,
May I rephrase that slightly?
You may.
Am I better off with Europe and the austerity measures that would be imposed by Europe to join the European Union? Or am I better off joining a country which has a stagnant and antiquated economy and which has a corruption level that is notable by independent bodies across the globe? Now, if you're well connected, you could do fine in a corrupt economy. I suspect that that's not the case for many of these folks. And so it's hard for me to imagine that the ordinary Ukrainian sees opportunity for him in joining Russia. Russia just does not operate. They have a history with Russia. Russia has cut off its pipelines, it's demanded debt, it's pressured them on every level. Russia has not been kind to Ukraine since 2006. So it seems to me that those experiences with Russia would tend to push Ukrainians towards Western Europe, or at least stunt their affinity for joining Russia. I'm not going to say that that necessarily pushed them to the European Union, but it shouldn't make them logically more interested in joining Russia. They have a confrontational history, an economic battering ram placed upon them with the natural gas payments in particular, the pipelines and the shutting off of natural gases to Ukraine. And it seems to me that ordinary Ukrainians would recognize this, that dealing with Russia, you're playing a losing hand all the time.
Well, I wouldn't disagree with that, but certainly for some in the East, they're not calculating that way that you're thinking, Jake. I mean, I think maybe the vast majority of Ukrainians, or from Kiev in the center to the west, are thinking that way. But whether it's nostalgia or misperception of the risk and gains to join Russia or Mother Russia, the perception is that somehow their life or their lot or their resources or their jobs or their income is somehow going to get better. You're right. They were abused under Russia. Their future isn't any better with going in that direction. But the perception is that they haven't had anything over the last 5 years of decrepit Ukrainian government with its own authoritarian despots stealing everything from them. This is just the latest turn, if you will, and this turn, at least especially in the east there, is towards the east, let's put it that way.
Dr. Lewandowski.
Just call me Jake, please.
I'm wondering if I missed something, because it seemed at first you were arguing for why people in eastern Ukraine would be interested in joining Russia, but then you said that Russia's been treating Ukrainians badly, so why would they want to do that? So are you saying that they're acting unreasonably? Or did I miss something?
No, you've done just exactly what I want you to do. It's illogical. So what must be going on? I am arguing that this second uprising is not an indigenous uprising of Ukrainians. Rather, it is fomented by Russia. That's so nicely done that you would have captured that. It saved me 2 steps. This is very good. So, and by the way, talking about Kiev, Kiev is up here. This is Kiev here. So this is very highly localized, this Russian affinity. It is much more localized than we are led to believe. So when we talk about Eastern Ukraine, literally, we are talking about Luhansk district and the Donetsk district.
There are more than that.
Yeah, and it's,
No, more than that. Significantly more than that. I think this map was set up, by right sector. Did they employ you? Right sector. This is unbelievably misleading, this map. So this group will be led to believe that so many Ukrainians speak Ukrainian language and that is dominant. That is not accurate. Again, this map does not look wholly script, I would say, because there are far more people who speak Russian as their native language,
and
that is a very
they speak both languages. They speak both languages.
No.
This is a map of predominance.
No. May make a comment here. It's open for discussion, obviously. Now, this is a major difference here. All Ukrainians speak Russian perfectly, almost, with an accent, but perfectly. There are relatively many people who do not speak Ukrainian at all, particularly in the East. The Ukrainian language for them is a serious challenge.
And
so that's a major story for Eastern Ukraine. So the language matter, the language question has some influence on their feelings. You present the situation as if relatively small number of residents there speak Russian. So a huge number of people speak Ukrainian, they were punished. And there is a small number who embrace Russia. Russian economy is corrupt, so Russia foments this. No, that is very inaccurate. It's clearly sponsored by the right sector.
You have evidence that that's inaccurate?
Absolutely.
You have evidence? Show me something.
We will walk to Eastern Ukraine now and you will see.
Alright, let's go on to does anybody have a question? I've been meaning to get to audience questions. Yes.
How does this map work? Is it just by people that speak majority Ukraine, or is it?
This is a map in which the Ukrainian people were asked what language they speak at home. Now, remember, the Russian that they speak is part of the Russification process, which started after 1917.
Oh.
But again, is it a majority? Is it if for example the majority of households in a town speak Ukrainian, would that be blue? Because it's not really like on
Yes.
a continuum. It's just like a.
That is correct. It is a dividing line. So we have more than 80%, less than 80% of the households have self-identified as speaking this language in these.
Jake, if I may say, that is brutal misrepresentation of the reality in Ukraine.
And because I must, because I must trust other people to
Yes, you could do
represent.
that. You have the right there, but I am expressing my opinion about that. I was there.
Can I see your map?
Pardon me?
Can I see your map? Give me your evidence.
I will give you my map from my experience. I live there, in Donetsk and everywhere. But that's fine. You could say what, we have freedom of expression. We do not have Putin's authoritarian rule, so you could use any map. But that is very questionable, to say the least. Again, in eastern Ukraine, Russian is the overwhelming language at home and everywhere. As far as rural areas are concerned, there is more veracity to the fact that people speak Ukrainian, but still there is overwhelming domination of the Russian language. It's a very serious matter.
And in
But there are more.
fact, that is the point I made. I said that Russification was strongest and most pronounced in the urban industrial areas. You just made the same argument that I did.
Yeah, I try to be on the good side of you, you know that. But you see, I try also to tell you the truth. And
As
the
you
truth
see it.
is that the Russian language has enormous attraction, and by all means.
You now
it
turn
was-
to your page on Russian chauvinism right now, because you just saw it in practice.
No, absolutely not.
Yes, it
But
has
let us
great attraction.
offer the audience an opportunity to raise questions. You are influenced by the Ukrainian nationalist propaganda. There is no
Man,
question.
I cannot tell you how much I have read for this. Now, I have not lived in Ukraine. May I ask when you last lived in Ukraine?
That was, I feel it's as if it were yesterday, but it was
You
in the
feel
70s.
as if it were, yes, you feel as if it were, and you feel that my map is a gross misjustice. And you feel that Ukraine,
Manipulation, without any doubt. Significant,
and yet you have not answered my question. When was the
in the
last time?
70s, in the
In the
70s.
70s.
Questions?
But it did not change that.
Casey?
Gentlemen,
I'm going to
Using that
myself.
term loosely.
if we for a moment forget the map, and my question is, there's an idea that Ukraine potentially faces a civil war over some citizens would prefer to be part of the European Union or at least have closer ties with the European Union, and some citizens would prefer to be closer with Russia, and in the case of Crimea, apparently they want to be part of Russia again. Does the European Union want the Ukraine? Like,
Oh, yeah, that's.
Is that-
You could answer this question.
Is
The
that-
point here is, you could discuss this very easily, offer answers here.
in
There is tremendous confrontation here between Eastern Ukraine, which wants affiliation with Russia, and Western Ukraine that has traditional tremendous dislike for Russia, that was nurtured not by Russification and all this stuff, but their association with Austro-Hungary, their affiliation with the Nazis, all sorts of very ugly things that were happening there. That did not go away. Bandera, you might have heard about this quote-unquote hero, murderer, killer, and other fellows who committed unspeakable crimes against civilians. And now they are presented as heroes, so the Russians cannot stand it, and some Ukrainians cannot stand it. That's a major point. And the West, United States, they have tremendous bias against Russia, and that created this terrible crisis.
I am making no argument that the Ukrainian nationalists are good guys. I am only making the argument that Russia is after the natural resources, the oil, the natural gas, the shale gas reserves, which are abundant in Ukraine. I am making the case that this is geopolitics at its most base. It is the theft of Ukrainian resources. I'm not making the argument that Ukrainians are nice guys.
I'm sorry. Do you think that the pro-Russian civilization in Eastern Ukraine, do you think their popular uprising is genuine, or do you think it's really?
I have my doubts, but again, how do I say this? I read, and what as a geopolitical animal, the thing that I do is I try to match what I read and what I hear to what I see on the ground. And what I see, because I do geography, is I see maps. And lots of people make lots of maps. You have to look at lots and lots of maps. You have to read lots and lots of stuff. You have to read the leftist literature. You have to read the right literature. You have to read all sorts of stuff. But that's the only way you're going to make an informed opinion. So I sit around and I read everything I can get my hands on.
Jake, there is one point that we need to discuss, a few points that are essential. Living standards in Ukraine are far worse than in Russia. Corruption in Ukraine is far worse than in Russia. That
then why is the life expectancy in Russia falling? It's down to 63 years.
No, Russia is
Yes.
also in bad shape, but Ukraine is in far worse shape. Lots of Ukrainians work in Russia. That's the argument which will convince you. You see, that's tremendous tool for Russia. They could have stopped Ukrainians from sending money to Ukraine. Again, living standards in Russia, that's a given. It's much more authentical than this map. The information about living standards, it's everywhere.
Apparently, we aren't leaving the map alone.
No,
We
no,
are
this
using the
map-
map as a
by the way,
springboard.
Jake, you could use this map. Again, there is some point in looking into such maps. There are real rural areas where they could speak Ukrainian more. But the overall picture is, I think, significantly different from what this map would inform you. That's my view. But you could have your own opinion.
How nice of you to allow me to have my own opinion. Several times now you have said you're welcome to your opinion. We have freedom of thought here. You are welcome to your opinion. I would argue that that is Russian chauvinism again. He is permitting me. Listen to what's going on. Listen to how the language is used. He is allowing me to have my opinion.
That's my policy. I am a Democrat.
I'm going to redirect because I have a huge interest, not that I am, in the ultra-nationalist segments of the Kiev uprising, as well as Russian, because, I mean, it's been a part of their histories. I mean, ever since you can go back to the Soviet Union, nationalism has always been a big part of the area. Ukraine's been fighting since, I guess you could say, World War II. I'm not going to support or say anything was bad about nationalism, but it seems like in Western media that it's been portrayed as if like they're a huge segment. I don't know how big the right sector or these pro-Bandera people are, but do we have any right to worry about the pro-Western side of their nationalist segment? Because it seems like either the news is playing it up or it actually is a factor, because when I was reading, it seems like they're not pro-West or East, they just don't like imperialism, period. So I want to direct it to the panel if we should actually be concerned about nationalism, period, let alone Russian nationalism overall. I mean, so.
Yes, it's open for identification, for analysis. It's hard to say. That is being discussed all the time, yes.
I
So
think
nobody knows for sure. But
Again,
it
it
is
may
a fact.
depend on, who you're talking to and what
Yes.
segment of the population you might be asking. Clearly, younger Ukrainians, from the center into to the west, are choosing Europe, right? They're choosing democracy. They're choosing Western open kind of style of living. They want access to travel, to jobs. They want access to better education and a better future. And they are the ones that were on the front end of that, the first uprising, if you will. Were there rightist and nationalist elements? Of course they are. They're trying to take advantage of the opportunity to poke Putin in the eye, to poke Russia in the eye, of course. But the vast majority of the people who are out there protesting and demanding a closer affiliation to the West and to the European Union are especially the young, especially the educated, especially the urban, who see the future and understand what the future is, and it's not despotic Putin and authoritarianism of whatever sort, right? So depending on who you want to focus on, or the media wants to focus on, you're going to get whatever story you want to tell. But I think the vast majority of Ukrainians, especially younger Ukrainians, know the answer, and the answer is with the West, with the European Union, with more openness and liberalism.
Yes, and economic considerations are important. The West overall could offer more, that's for sure.
In the long term. I think in
Exactly.
the short term, again, going back to the people in the East, they see some kind of short-term nostalgia for Russia and a better life, and the hope of some of the wealth that they see on their TV for on propaganda coming from Russia, that somehow is luring them to choose to move to the East. So
Yes, question.
How does that fit in as far as, I know you're talking a little bit demographics, but what are the support range as far as income disparity? Because you said like the young and the educated. I'm guessing the young and the educated have more opportunities to wealth, and so how does, are the upper class more supportive of pro-Russia or pro-Ukraine? Or is it more just like where they are on what side of the country, or does income play a part in it at all?
There's not a lot of people who are really well off, per se. There are certainly a lot of well-educated Ukrainians, especially young Ukrainians who have studied in Europe, who have studied in the West, who studied in the United States for that matter, or have studied around the world. And they have a clear sense of what they want, and they want a better life, but they don't want to see it under an authoritarian rule of whatever slant you're going to talk about. So if you're older, more rural, and less educated and less well off, those people are more likely to be choosing, at least what they perceive to be the short-term solution. And yet, I mean, Russia does have its economic problems, there's no doubt about it, but at the same time, there could be a quick fix. There could be some quick payments, some quick paychecks, some quick access to Russian resources, to some of the natural resource money can flow very quickly into the pockets of some of these Eastern Ukrainians. That's what they see, and that's what some of them are asking for. But in the long term, we know that comes with a lot of strings attached and conditions attached in and of itself. So I think, again, younger, urban, well-educated, more Western-leaning in that sense, Ukrainians know that the long-term solution is not, a choice to move to Putin or to Russia. It's very obvious.
Any other questions? Okay. Oh, Casey.
I've seen some discussion in the media of the similarities between Putin's annexation of Crimea and Hitler's action in Sudetenland prior to World War II. Is there any reality in that kind of claim that those are the same action? Is there any potential for military action on a global scale because of this conflict?
So you had to bring the Germans in. Is that? I mean, you got the Ukrainian, you got the Russian, and you got the German here. Is this what it is?
And that is the revanchism. The only thing that's common to those actually is the revanchism. That is starting new conflicts to redress wrongs suffered from old conflicts.
And I don't disagree in some ways. I mean, we always have to be very careful with these historical analogies. It's apples and oranges in many ways. But at the same time, you look at, a disgruntled and weakened Russia, a disgruntled and weakened Germany after World War I, after the end of the Cold War, in a sense that somehow, the West or others have pushed Russia into a corner. They are striking back. The revanchism, the revenge, to right the wrongs, if you will. And again, going back to Dr. Polsky's notion of understanding the capabilities or limitations of U.S. power and the capabilities of Russian power. This is in Russia's zone of influence and sphere of influence, and there's not much that the West or the EU can really do to alter some of that reality on the ground. At the same time, I'm not seeing that the Russians want to escalate this into some Hitler-ish, conquest of all of the world or Europe, for that matter.
That's because they do not want that. What they want
I agree,
are to capture the resources. Let me just read to you what they got when they took over Crimea. When they took over Crimea, they got two major oil fields, an estimated 7 trillion cubic meters of shale gas. That's on the mainland, by the way. The Yuzviska field, there were 7 million cubic meters of gas. The Ukrainian right wing, or the independent Ukraine, whichever you'd care to call it, at that time, the government of Kiev had signed an agreement with Western oil companies to exploit those oil and natural gas reserves from Crimea. And when he annexed them, he got 10 oil fields, 5 natural gas fields, 3 gas condensate fields, all in the Black Sea alone, on the continental shelf around Crimea. That's what he's after. He does not want to, I I feel, I hesitate to interpret anyone's actions, much less interpret maps. But if you look at what he is claiming, he has claimed all sorts of resources. 44 significant hydrocarbon deposits, 165 billion cubic meters of natural gas, 182 million tons of gas condensate, 47 million tons of oil, just from acquiring Ukraine. And by the way, if your economy is structured on controlling energy resources, as the Russian economy is, it constitutes 50% of their income, it funds 70% of their social programs. If your economy is based on that, the way to control prices is to control supplies. And how do you control supplies? You capture the territory that has the deposits. And I'm arguing that that's what's going on.
Jake, I hate to disagree with you totally
Oh,
here.
I'm sure you do.
And I want to offer you a comparison you would like. Castro, we remember him, a great man. He has lots of sugar, and he was selling them to the United States. And there was an embargo, and the Soviet Union would buy Cuban sugar. So I would argue that Russia needs Ukrainian resources as much as the Soviet Union needed Cuban sugar. Soviet Union had enough sugar to make life sweet for every person, without Cuban sugar.
Oh.
The reason for that action.
No. Take a minute here and think what's going on. We're talking two different things. He says they don't need the sugar to use it, and I agree with that. What they don't need the sugar, they don't need the oil to use it. They need the oil to take it off the market, to control supply. Thank you.
No.
I got people pushing me around
Jake,
everywhere.
listen, let me finish my point, but I think you flatter Putin a great deal, that he has economic consideration. I think here territory, pride is a big stake, that Russia wants to get influence back. That's the major concern. Russia has tremendous resources, but they cannot use them effectively. So maybe you're right, but my feeling is that Putin wants to restore pride and strength. That's what he wants to do. That's a major consideration. Crimea is so valuable, and Eastern Ukraine, it's so valuable to them. So they do the same thing as they did in Georgia, I think. But maybe you're right, they have these considerations about taking over Ukrainian resources. But Russian mass media does not discuss that. Even enemies of Putin do not say that so far. So you could make a point on your blog or whatever that that's a major consideration.
Okay, I feel like you're both kind of in agreement in revanchism.
Revanchism.
Revanchism?
Yes, that's
It's
where.
the French word for revenge.
Yes.
I wanted to kind of redirect, but not, because I feel like there's a common core to your guys' argument there on restore pride or glory, I think with the definition in the notes. My question is, and I'm not supporting Putin's actions, is kind of didn't NATO and more of the pro-West, pro-US forces kind of corner them and kind of push more of this kind of perspective because of the continuing gathering of nations that Russia once considered in his sphere? I mean, I'm not trying to say he's right in doing it or he's validated, but we did kind of start picking up, country after country or, some wanted to join NATO. And what is the role of NATO right now in this conflict as well? I just wanted to make a two-pronged question there.
NATO sits still, it just offers lip service. They do not do anything at this point, and Russia does not take them seriously because nobody will fight for Ukraine. That's the point. It's total talk and nothing on the ground. So no forces will be sent to Ukraine. Ukraine is on its own to fight with Russia. That's the consideration that should have been taken into account beforehand. Nothing was done. But Russia creates tremendous problems. After this conflict with Ukraine, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Slovakia, Poland, the Czech Republic, Romania, they will be scared to death. And they will do everything to hurt Russia everywhere possible. That's what I'm saying. It's a disaster and very bad thing for everybody.
Well, in some ways, what it does is you're right, it exposes some of the weaknesses of NATO, but it also can strengthen it. I mean, one of the basic questions is what is the reason of being, if you will, for NATO? And you could have said there is no reason for it other than to send, stability troops to Afghanistan or Bosnia or something like that, which, is important. But its reason of being is to secure Europe. And that was what it was set up for originally during the Cold War, and while it's taken a bit of time, that is now what its reason of being is going to be for the future of Europe, and that's to protect the rest of Europe from, Russian expansionism and influence and control. So these Eastern European countries, the Baltic countries, will be even more tightly encased into the Western sphere of influence under NATO. And while, there's nothing that NATO can do in the Ukraine, I mean, it's an absolute joke to think that the U.S. or NATO would do anything militarily in the Ukraine. What it does is lock in even tighter that alliance system, which, will cause some backlash against Russia.
Exactly, that's what I'm saying.
And, it will not go unnoticed by Putin that, that there's backlash for Western expansionism into Russia's, Western borders, but there's also a backlash as well to Putin, and that will be a tightening and strengthening of the kind of NATO alliance and the Western alliance. There's no doubt about that.
Absolutely.
I'm not sure how much he will care about strengthening NATO as long as he controls 80% of Germany's gas imports, 30% on average for all of Europe. If he controls their gas for heating and production, if he controls the natural gas supply, and he can dictate prices, I'm not sure he really cares if there is a European Union at all.
That is the point. Now there will be pressure on Germany, on all forces, on groups that cooperate with Russia to scale it down big way. That's the point. That's what I think may happen. Putin will pay for that, for this emotional outbreak.
And yet, the European Union has already established laws against fracking so that they cannot get, Poland has enormous amounts of shale gas. But by European Union rules, they're not allowed to exploit that because the technology of fracking is, if you'll forgive me, verboten.
Yeah.
You wouldn't say that in Poland, but,
Yes, now they will do everything to hurt Russia because the pain is big.
Yes.
So now they may come together to assess all of this tremendously. That's what I think might happen.
And that is a long-term prospect. In the meanwhile, Putin has a great deal of control over them and their economies.
Yes, again, but
It's
it
gonna
may
take-
be short-lived. It looks like a steady factor. But with this gamble in Ukraine, it may change dramatically. When we come back home, we will see what you could look at the computer, whether fighting started in Kramatorsk, Lugansk, everywhere. You never know what the bottom line will be. Yeah, if people like McCain come to power, they may be seduced to send troops to Ukraine because they hate Russia so bitterly. You never know. McCain, it's unbelievable.
No, I think McCain has visions of restoring great American power the way Putin, as you just guys told me, has visions of restoring great Russian power. He wants to be a global player, a great power politician. That was what you guys just told me. And McCain is practicing the same thing with respect to Russia. He bemoans the loss of the United States' preeminence in global affairs. So he would be doing nothing more than Putin has been doing.
I don't think, McCain has visions, but I don't know what kind of visions he has in his own
Very sick vision.
They're problematic. I mean, the United States still is a global power. Russia is not a global power. It is a regional power.
As
Yes, the president
Obama
said.
has said.
Yeah, and I think we have, the United States should recognize that and it has to kind of accept some of the reality of Russian influence in that region. There's nothing we can do about it, whether it was in the Crimea or in the Ukraine for that matter. We can issue ultimatums, we can issue some sanctions,
Yes.
we can clamp down a little bit on Putin and his cronies, but in the end, I think the reality of the power relationship suggests some kind of equilibrium, some kind of stalemate, some kind of negotiated
Compromise.
a renewed détente of one sort or another, because they need each other. Europe needs Russia, they need the gas, you're right,
Exactly.
absolutely. a trap. But Russia also needs investment from the West, it needs technology from the West, it needs trade routes to continue to flow to the West. You know, perhaps some saner heads will prevail in the end, because
Hopefully,
it's
yes.
both in their interest not to see this escalate out of control.
Yeah, that's for sure.
That doesn't mean that it won't.
Exactly, exactly. I agree with, it may escalate very badly, very
And very
quickly.
quickly.
We could.
Exactly, so we agree on that completely.
I don't agree with you on that.
Question?
How do the Russians, like people in actual Russia, feel about what's going on in Ukraine?
There is a divide, but the majority support Putin, the majority. But there are people who hate him bitterly and speak out firmly, regardless of the consequences.
Like strong
He throws them in jail.
No, that did not happen as of now. But maybe it will happen sometime. But Putin speaks out very brutally about them, that they're traitors and so on, but no action has been taken. It may happen.
I believe Khodorkovsky.
Khodorkovsky, it's a different story. He's speaking out for Ukraine now, but he's out of the country. But inside Russia, there are
But he has been
intellectuals.
thrown in jail when he challenged Putin.
Yes, on a different occasion. Yes, he,
Yes.
apparently, that's what.
So I restate my case.
Yes,
You
Putin
speak up
believes
to
he's right.
Putin, you get thrown in jail.
I think
Yes, yes, right.
but that's true. But many, I think, Russians see the economic costs associated and will feel the pain and feel the pinch ever more and more of Putin's actions. And while they might accept some of the kind of nationalistic rhetoric and the return to great power and the restoring of Russian pride, they like that. They're also looking in their pocketbooks and seeing problems. And the problems are associated with Putin's actions. Now, they won't speak out, they'll get thrown in jail, or they might get beat up in the streets, or they just feel intimidated and scared to do so. But at the same time, they know that long-term strategy of Putin will be a failed strategy, because it won't bring them the economic kind of riches and development that they know lies over in the West. They see it.
And as long as Putin remains in power, it won't matter what they see.
And
Well,
Putin will
it's-
stay there for a long time.
Yes, he will.
That
Yes,
may
he
be
will.
true, but you may have, in 10 years, another uprising centered on what's going on in Moscow. You heard it here first. Dr. Lodel predicted that.
Set your calendar, 10 years.
Blood moon.
2024.
20.
I wanna-
I'll still be here. We'll all still be here.
Hopefully we will.
Jake's beard will be down to the floor, I think, but
Any other questions from the audience? Because I have a question. I'm a little bit concerned in terms of the European Union, and maybe this is just my American bias, and also because I don't really tend to like the U.S. media playing it up as if this is a U.S. responsibility or something along those lines. I think that the European Union has to take a more assertive step. I have noticed that Germany's been kind of leading the way, having private talks with Putin on the phone, Angela Merkel. But is it a matter of who blinks first? I mean, because he already took the peninsula. So what's the next logical step? I mean, is there any possible way of negotiating back the peninsula via the European Union, or is that thing just gone unless some sort of conflict arises?
It is gone. It also presents another geostrategic problem. That peninsula has to be supplied. It gets 90% of its electricity and 80% of its water, mostly for irrigation, through what's known as the North Crimean Canal. And that, to sustain any sort of economic activity or any sort of population on the peninsula, requires an enormous amount of resources. And since it is not connected directly to Russia, Russia is going to have access to the Crimean Peninsula.
They're building a bridge.
Across the Kerch, yes.
Exactly.
They did that after World War II. They built a bridge. Medvedev just, in fact, approved this a couple of months ago, this new bridge. But that new bridge is going to take time.
Yes.
It's got to be designed and built. When they built it after World War II, they did not include breakwaters. And so ice destroyed that bridge within 4 years. It collapsed. So a bridge is scheduled to be built, but It's a long time, that's 4 years to go without supplies. And I argue again that he's gonna need a land route along eastern Ukraine down to, and this then also corresponds to the location of this pro-Russian uprisings. He is gonna be using this opportunity to take over these eastern districts, and he will then have a land route with which to supply.
Yes.
His
They
property
should
is
have agreed on renting Crimea for 10 years, something like that. You see, and then we arrange some other compromise.
However, there's a whole lot of natural gas and oil on the shoreline of Ukraine, and if
Yes, Ukraine has tremendous natural resources,
Yes, it
but
does.
it does not help the economic development of this country after it
and it
became
doesn't
independent.
have to. It has to. Once Putin takes it over, all it has to do is feed Putin and his power structure, and I believe that is what is going
I'll
on.
go back to your question, Christian, about the challenge to the EU. This is probably one of the more significant challenges to the EU. I mean, the EU is predicated on resolving international conflict through negotiation, through diplomacy, through, creation of international regimes of one sort to alleviate pressures for conflict. And what you have here, in a sense, is a rearranging of the map of Europe, if you want to throw the Crimea and Ukraine and that part into Europe. The rearranging of the map through blunt use of power and force and military force. And this goes counter to everything that the EU has been striving for the last 60 years. So the EU is confronted by a country and a power that doesn't play by the EU rules of how we resolve disputes. And it is perplexed in a way that it doesn't really know quite what to do, right? It faced the same issue back in the Yugoslavian Civil War, and it was the EU kind of standing there impotent and powerless till the United States stepped in to kind of solve that problem, right? And it was U.S. force and NATO force that did that in the end. What does the EU have? Diplomatic power, political power, economic power. It has offered some economic incentives and support for the Ukrainian government. That's backed up by Germany as well, but Germany also has its economic dependency and connections to Russia, its business connections, the gas pipelines that say that we've got to find some kind of compromise, negotiated compromise to the crisis. But it looks somewhat weak and fractured right now, right? And it begs the question about whether the European Union model for resolving disputes can deal with the reality of blunt force power and trauma, if you will, that Russia is exposing, if you will, the EU's weaknesses. And I don't know, it's a crisis of some way for the European Union project, right? I mean, the EU could say, well, we write off the Crimea, we write off half of the Ukraine perhaps, and we see what happens, right? But that spillover of instability will spill over into into Europe, into the European Union member states. It already is economically. Refugees are people are leaving. It's affecting the stock markets. It's affecting their economies. It's devastating. It's really devastating. It's a major crisis.
For everyone except Putin.
He has not calculated that yet. He is still impressed by his own actions. Yes, he lives in a parallel world, as who said that?
Yes. Thank you, Angela Merkel. Yes.
True. But in 10 years, we'll be here talking about the end of Putin.
So I'm told. It is the practice of great power geopolitics in which he is engaged. And as the European Union becomes weaker, he acquires more and more territory. There is still no way to stop him. The EU is built upon negotiations, discussions, and compromise. He has no interest in it that I can see, and no reason for engaging in it that I can see. So he gains strength the more territory he takes.